Cool.
All right, we will get into the episode this week on Left of the Projector for Glass Onion, a Knives Out mystery. And here to discuss the film with me, I have Amanda and Al and Soren. Thank you all for joining me today.
Hey.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, before we jump into the movie and kind of get into our discussion, I'm just going to give a quick, brief synopsis for anyone who maybe hasn't seen it, or just to recap the movie in less than a minute. The movie came out last year, end of last year. It was also then released pretty quickly onto Netflix with a budget of $40 million. It was seemingly a box office bomb. It only made $15 million plus whatever Netflix ended up paying for the film rights. The movie is basically a pandemic era, takes place during the pandemic era, where Miles Braun, a billionaire co-founder of the company Alpha, invites his 5 longtime friends to his private island in Greece for a murder mystery game to solve who had murdered him. The 6th guest on the island is famous detective Benoit Blanc, which ties this into the original Knives Out movie. The 5 of them plus Benoit Blanc have to eventually solve an actual murder of one of their friends, Duke, as well as the potential death, they believe, of their friend Andy. As we'll learn later, it's actually her twin sister Helen, and we uncover the mystery as it goes. I guess the question we might ask is, does the rich, arrogant billionaire Miles Braun actually get what's coming to him? Maybe, maybe not. But I guess before we jump into some of the themes, when everyone watched this, did they immediately think of Elon Musk as Miles Braun, or did you have another billionaire archetype in mind?
It seems like he's kind of a mishmash of a few, because of the Alpha thing. He says Alpha DJ played this music. It seems reminiscent of Jeff Bezos,
Yeah,
and and Alex, that one, and then of course Elon Musk, because he's the cool billionaire and he's trying to portray himself as such.
He's creative.
yeah.
I did not initially perceive him that way. And I think like later on it becomes very clear. And like if you read outside of the context of the movie, like what I have heard is that is like explicitly what Rian Johnson was intending him to be. But I think for me, like that wasn't the main kind of parallel that I got, was like from the movie as a whole, was like that personality kind of tie-in. So like when he called him out at the end and he had that line where he was like, Miles Braun is an idiot, right? Like then I was like, yeah, this is Elon, especially after all of like, the Twitter debacle and stuff that's gone down. Like I think at that point it's really clear, but I didn't really focus on that tie-in until that point, personally.
Yeah, I think for me it was, I think I had seen something about the movie. I try and like when I see a movie, unless it's been out for a long time, I try to go in without like any knowledge of the movie to kind of go in clean. And I think I had read something about it being like a stand-in for Elon Musk. So I think that seeped into my reading or my watching of the movie. But I guess before we get into, once they get to the island, I think we might want a good place to maybe start with the movie is, well, maybe ask you all, what was some of your impressions of the movie, and how it serves its kind of intended purpose, I guess, is to kind of skewer the billionaire class a bit and show kind of what's really behind the curtain amongst, their companies and their actual, quote unquote genius. So whatever you
Well, I think that a lot of it exploits the idea that a lot of his ideas are other people's ideas. A lot of his work are other people's work. Even the film introduces itself making you think he's a genius because he's sending out these intricate invitations. And you're thinking, wow, this guy's, like a regular Leonardo da Vinci over here. And then like,
yeah. So fun.
Yeah. And then come to find out someone came up with that. Someone came up with the murder plot. Someone came up with the sound, the that rings every hour.
Philip Glass.
And so everything is a borrowed idea or a stolen idea with this person.
Yeah, exploitation. He's only cool because of the exploitation of the people that he surrounds himself with, including his friends. His friendships is also him capitalizing whatever his social capital is with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, totally. I think it did a really good job of that. For me, I felt like that was the part of the movie that was a little bit more heavy-handed for me. You know, like there was definitely a lot of kind of portrayals of characters that are kind of like a stereotypical, you know, kind of way. Like it's a little bit heavy-handed in that regard. And I thought the portrayal of, you know, like Miles as that kind of billionaire is definitely that. So, you know, it was kind of fun. Like I was like chuckling at it the whole time, but it was, if that had been like the main thrust of the movie for me, I don't think I would have liked it as much as I did. But yeah, it was enjoyable for sure. I think like all of the pokes were, you know, good, right? Like they all landed for me. I had a good time with it for sure.
Yeah, I think that that was one of my sort of, I guess, themes that I noticed in the movie is that all of the characters do have a very stereotyped kind of version. I mean, I guess maybe it's worth going before we kind of go into as the plot goes through, is to talk about the characters, because I think that they each were written to fill a certain, you know, aspect of society. So to start, well, we talked about, you know, Miles Braun a bit, as you said, Al, is that he's made to seem as this brilliant guy when he's kind of just paying everyone to do all of the things that he's showered with for, you know, with praise. So the first one I guess we can talk about is Kate Hudson. So she's or the actress Kate Hudson plays Birdie J, former model, and then we find out that she has like a sweatpants brand that, you know, she's essentially, you know, kind of gotten Elon. I almost said his name is Elon Musk. Gotten Miles Braun's money, and so I think that's a common theme: is they're all tied up in money and investing or services from Miles Braun, played by Edward Norton. So, you know, we don't have to only focus on her, but I thought her character was interesting. It was meant to be like this, kind of like the female version of almost like Donald Trump, in the sense that she says the thing that like you're not supposed to say, but doesn't care.
Yeah.
Gets banned from Twitter, or not banned, but
In hot water.
in hot water. Yeah.
And she has to have Peg fix it up for her. I think a lot of the characters are all like meant to kind of like satiate some sort of like pandemic. I don't know how to explain it. Like they exist so we can feel better about them existing, I guess you'd say. Like and she's the most exaggerated, like the whole like, oh, they're in not my bubble but they're in my pod. Like you heard a lot of that in that, and like they're just like recklessness and extreme selfishness is like her she's an embodiment of that, and especially like, oh, I just say what I think, and you know, but then Blanc is like, there's a difference between say what you think and not thinking about what you say. But she embodies just like an exaggerated, and sometimes not so exaggerated, I'm sure there's plenty of people that literally exist like her, of like this pandemic person. I don't know, like this the pod thing. Like, should you be having a party? No, they're in my pod. I heard a lot of that, like from people, and just like, yeah.
And then they were like, why am I so sick with COVID right now? I was in my pod of 1,000 people. You know?
I thought that was a hilarious line. Like that line in her intro was like, okay, this paints that character perfectly. Like I know exactly who this is.
Yeah.
But somehow Yo-Yo Ma is in her pod because he's the one who like comes over. I don't know if anyone caught that, but
I was wondering who that was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's the one who identifies the song or the song pattern, which I'm not a musician, but at least I recognize him when I saw that. But yeah, I think you nailed, you know, her character as far as kind of what she embodied. And then the one that I think is actually the one I'll mention next, I think is actually an interesting character, which also embodies that like COVID era nostalgia, if you could even call it that, given that COVID is still here. But the character played by Catherine Hahn, which is Claire, I think her last name is Debola, pronouncing it right. She's a candidate for governor. She has all these Zoom jokes or Zoom lines about, being at home. It's a childcare, which, anyone with kids like myself probably can identify with, having been in a similar case, not necessarily running for governor, but, being at home and having to deal with that. And she tries to make herself or paint herself off as very down to earth. And I think that was something that everyone identified with, but then she kind of shows no value. Like, she doesn't really seem to have any values. It's whatever the values that she needs. They're flexible, I think is what I wrote.
Yeah.
When Duke dies, she's the first to not want the blowback from that. She goes, "Oh no, I can't be here with a men's rights activist
that
just died in an investigation during COVID."
Yeah.
She's worried about the optics of her what she'll be portraying as.
Oh, the whole time, the entire time. And it's interesting. I want to point out, like, her husband. I think that there was probably a point where she was more actually authentic and down to earth. If you look at her husband's t-shirt, he's wearing like a Greenpeace t-shirt, which is like, pretty typical liberal shit, but whatever. It's something. But like, I feel like he's kind of a shadow of what she perhaps once was. But then, money corrupts. I mean, she's backed by a billionaire. You're going to do what the billionaire says and wants.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And for me, like, I think that was one of the most kind of important aspects of this movie was, like, yes, all of the characters are somewhat broad strokes, like a little bit heavy handed. But I think the main kind of thing that pulled me in is the way that they all relate, not just to Miles, but like to the money, like Miles isn't anyone without the money. Right. And that's acknowledged like pretty early on. And then, like when it gets into the history of them at the Glass Onion, that's kind of like the story that is told is like, oh, these all used to be like, like genuine people who had like their own hopes and dreams. So like, what you're talking about with the governor, like 100%. I think that is probably her background. And then it took someone to kind of like give her the nudge to get in to like try to play the game. Right. And to leave that behind a little bit for the sake of being successful or advancing her political career. And, then we see her at the point later in her life where the movie starts where, maybe that's her background, but that's definitely not who she is anymore. Exactly. I like that a lot.
I thought it was interesting. So I pointed this out when we saw them get off the boat. They're all wearing masks, but different types of masks.
Mm-hmm.
So Benoit Blanc is wearing the cloth mask. It's kind of iconic, especially for that era of COVID, for someone who's trying to do their best, Then there's Birdie, who's wearing literally just like a net for a mask. It's like,
it's very on brand.
But then, Duke isn't wearing a mask because he's the kind of libertarian surfboard, cars up on jacks behind him during his videos.
In his mom's garage.
Gun in his Speedo type person. And then, obviously the politician has, the mask that's drooping below her nose. Everyone's kind of personifying these different people just with their masks and their mask etiquette, especially during the non-vaccine portion of COVID.
Yeah, 100%. I had that exact same note like written down when I rewatched this to get notes, and I was like, yeah, that is a good detail. Yeah, I feel like there were a lot of good little details like that in this movie. Yeah.
Well, so since you mentioned Duke, well, you mentioned all the characters, but I think that Duke is another interesting character that you could say sort of, I think when I put my notes in, I think I forgot to include him, but he's he's referred to later as like a men's rights activist. He was banned from Twitch for selling like pills that had things that you shouldn't be, that like was illegal, not FDA approved, like rhino, whatever. And he's, like you said, he's like a libertarian. He's got his gun. He's, doesn't care about, he's kind of like Birdie in the sense that I would say they're both sort of Republican light. Maybe that's what Birdie is, or kind of maybe.
She'd probably consider herself like middle of the road. I'm not involved.
Right. Like, yeah, I don't follow politics. Whereas Duke, you would probably be, that right wing type, person. And so, he's the guy who would have been out front, like demanding, mask mandates or something.
Yeah, I don't know. I was trying to think of like what Duke, like what his family history is, because his mom has like kind of like a New York Hebrew accent, like, and I'm like, is he Jewish? Is he from that? And his mom is pretty old. Like, is she a survivor? Like, is he a product of this that's just grown septic after?
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah,
he's definitely at the mercy of his mom. Like, his mom is the dominator.
Yeah, I feel like, in a somewhat heavy-handed way, but like I feel like he's definitely pretty clearly just portrayed as like a child from the beginning, right? Like, first scene we see him in, he has this facade where he's doing his podcast, like, men's manosphere, whatever kind of thing, and then like literally right after that, it's like, oh no, he's still 100% like living with his mom, or like his mom is right there, like he is a child. And I don't know, maybe that's not the most nuanced analysis of like the psychology of those kind of people, but it was pretty clear. It landed for me, and I was like, yeah, okay, I get it.
What's sort of funny about the fact that he, like, you mentioned like living in his mom's garage or something. I picture like that's the kind of person who is like commenting on social media posts being like, hey, stop, get out of your parents' like basement or garage. And it's like, he's the actual one who lives this life, but he's the one I know that's what I immediately pictured when I thought of Duke.
Well, and a lot of those people too, they often call anyone who's not tough like them a cuck. That's like their favorite thing to call them, when he literally is a cuckold in the movie.
I also like just a little detail that I love, but I love the detail where, they're all trying to solve the puzzle box, right? And the mom is just over in the corner in the kitchen just being like, it's a compass. It's
the Fibonacci sequence.
It's the Fibonacci. Yeah. Just like casually, like it's, in their world, it's like this very intense set of puzzles. Right. And, then for her, she's just kind of over the corner, like, it's obviously this. Right. And I don't know. I think I feel like there's a little bit of a psychology analogy there, because I think like there's this huge theme throughout the movie of like the meritocracy, right? Which Evan, I saw you had in your notes as well. And that was like one of the main things that I had in my notes. But like, they all very clearly believe in this. They believe Miles is a genius, and he sent them this box with these like unsolvable puzzles, and they're just like very much buying into it. And then, the mom is just over in the corner, just casually being like, this is what it is, like, yeah. And then I guess I don't know if we're like moving on to these themes later or not, but I also love the theme of Helen, right, and the way that she deals with the box, which is kind of I feel like a little microcosm of the whole movie, right?
For sure, yeah. Well, it's interesting you brought up the meritocracy. That, like you said, it's one of the things I noticed. I think I guess we might as well kind of cover the other couple characters. So we didn't really talk about Benoit Blanc. I don't know if anyone wants to share about him. I think he's clearly wealthy. It's clear by his apartment and his living situation and all of that. And I think there's no police in this movie, and I know this probably comes into play later in the last 20 minutes or so, when he's unable to really do anything about the situation because he's not actually of the law. He's just he's like a private detective. He is, in a sense, like a stand-in for the judicial courts, police, and they can't do anything to stop rich people, which that was my take on. I know maybe jumping ahead, but since we're going to mention him, I think it's worth it now.
Yeah, I very much have a similar read. I think you could see him as a stand-in for like, the system generally,
Yeah.
right? The courts, etc. But like, I also kind of think it's interesting to read him as a stand-in for Ryan Johnson, for the movie makers, right? And like, I feel like there's a couple scenes later on where he has some pretty on the nose, but like on the nose in a subtle way, like dialogue that's, I think, more speaking to the relation between anti-capitalist media like this and the way that it, like, the people viewing it have to relate to it. And yeah, I think this was something that was this case in Knives Out as well. He doesn't really have a super active role. He's kind of highlighting what's going on and opening pathways for the other like main character, Helen in this case. But he's not a super active character, and personally, I kind of like that, and kind of I think helps me at least view him as a stand-in. Yeah,
He simplifies the story, which is good for such an intricate story of so many characters. It's like he drops the major bomb, which everyone's thinking already, which is you brought a lot of people that want to kill you here, and then it's like putting a loaded gun on the table and then turning off the lights off. It's he's helping move the story along in the direction that the story writer, the storyteller wants, without making it too obvious. I mean, it's obvious, but it's because he's doing what his job is in the storyline. Mm-hmm. It harmonizes with the storyline, but simplifies it.
He's also kind of a safe character. He's kind of like a safety net for, like, when he does have his interactions with people, he's a safe person. That's how I feel like. And he also kind of, like, when he first gets off the boat, I thought that was interesting. I didn't really think about him having a whole lot of money, but maybe because I'm so focused on everyone else being so wealthy. But like when he gets off, he's like, oh, I'm not used to this like rich person stuff. But he says to Helen, Andy, that we think is Andy at the time. And I'm like, oh, is he like the like kind of working class relief? Maybe he was. Maybe he is like what grew up like more humble and like grew into his wealth, which,
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any like an ethical way to do that, but maybe from his genius. I don't know, but
it's detective-y.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was I just going to mention with the well, I know this isn't a main character in the show, and just because you mentioned sort of like the middle class character, and this, I didn't even really pick up on this possible like thread until I watched it again the most recent time, is the character Daryl, who's just on the island, just drinking and smoking weed and walking around and like being like, up, don't, I'm just here to, I won't bother you all. And at first I'm like, oh, this is just, it's kind of like it's clearly a joke. And I didn't really get much from it. But then in my most recent time, I'm thinking, is Daryl meant to be sort of some kind of, so I think what I wrote down was like what liberals see is the average person, just kind of like aimlessly walking around, doesn't really know what's going on. But then also thinking of being like COVID, he's kind of like coping with the life at that time by drinking and, getting high because shit sucked.
Oh, also, like, what does Miles owe that guy? He's like, oh, he's going through a tough time. Like,
yeah,
can't use him for anything, can he? I don't know.
I'm gonna be honest. I also did not really know what to make of him, but I feel like the closest I can get to making sense of him is he's just kind of a red herring for the murder mystery thing, right? Because he's just there, which raises the question: why is he there? And the whole movie, the first time I was watching it, I was like, okay, this guy's gonna be involved somehow. Like, they wouldn't have just introduced this totally random character wandering around the island if he wasn't gonna be involved in the mystery somehow. And then he's just not. Like, I don't know. And I kind of feel like maybe there's some analogy there, but for me, I kind of thought it was more of just like a funny plot device, just kind of like, let's give the audience something to follow a little bit. I mean, I guess he's not quite a red herring. Like, he's not obvious enough to be that, but he's something. Like, he's just an open question, and I kind of like that.
I think
I
it's
don't
one
know.
of those things that maybe the first time you watch it, you have that sense because you don't know what's going to happen. But then,
Mhm.
especially I'm like watching it, like trying to like think about things, putting too much meaning into him, perhaps. But I guess
Yeah.
the only two characters we didn't talk about is Lionel Toussaint. He is the person who works at Alpha, and then Andy, who we find out later is also Helen, or is Helen. We never actually really have Andy in the movie, with the exception of a couple small scenes. So I think that Helen deserves, I think, some additional discussion. But Lionel was a scientist, it seemed like, who couldn't publish any work in his early days. And then he goes to work for Miles Braun and basically is like his yes man. He does whatever he tells him to do. And I felt like his character was like the least compelling for some reason.
Hmm.
I don't know why. I don't know what it was. It didn't feel like he had as much depth as some of the other. They didn't have that much depth.
No,
I don't know.
I liked Lionel, right?
Lionel, yeah, I think that's right.
I really like Lionel, and I feel like with Lionel, there's this, for me at least, there was this dynamic where like he's a yes man, but like not really. I guess maybe I wouldn't say I felt like he was a yes man. I think he ends up like green lighting, like the way he's portrayed to me is like he ends up going along with what Miles wants because Miles has the money ultimately. But pretty much right from the beginning, like the first scene we see of him, he's clearly not happy with it. Like he's uncomfortable with what Miles is sending him. He's like, this is insane. It could get people killed. Like half his ideas, most of his ideas are complete bullshit. And then like some of them end up working out. But like, he very clearly has this kind of like, is terse the word? Is that one? No, that's not quite the word. This fraught relationship with Miles.
Yeah.
Where like he goes along with it, and he does give him that kind of scientific backing for what he wants to do, but he's clearly not happy about it. Which for me was, I think, kind of the common thread through all of the characters, right? Is that they all have their relationships with Miles, but none of them are really happy with him, like they all, which is literally like the plot premise of the movie, right? They all want to kill him for some reason or another. And I for me, I felt like with Lionel, that was like pretty clear and also interesting because of the role that he has, like when we're making analogies to the real world, right? The role that he has as a scientist, right? When we're talking about capitalism, like to what extent is the scientific community going along with systems and such that they are not really comfortable with because of the money factor, which I thought Lionel was a great analogy for. And like yeah, I don't know. That was my read on it.
No, that actually, yeah. I'm glad that kind of gives me more sense of him too. I think you look like you wanted to chime in, Amanda.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm in college. So a few terms back, I took a class on volcanoes and earthquakes. And living in the Pacific Northwest, probably shouldn't have done that. But now I know. It's terrifying. Have a go bag ready. But we had to go through, like, there's these online scenarios that you can do, and you act like you're a volcanologist. So you're trying to, check all the different things that you need to check to predict, like, earthquake, or not earthquake, but a eruption from the volcano. So there's like gas levels, there's soil, you have to think about liquefaction, stuff like that. But also, so this whole scenario is just like a fake scenario, and you go through and you check all the levels and stuff, and there's like certain levels that you can alert the public of, like how much of a danger it is, right? But you can't like skip from like 1 to 5, and each time that you stay in certain levels, it costs a certain amount of money. So you have to think about the science, you have to think about how much it costs money and how like it's going to affect the public, because there's this thing that we saw on COVID that like there's like a trauma fatigue, like people get so tired of dealing with the pandemic, so a lot of people just kind of gave up. But anyway, so that's what I kind of I guess sympathize a little bit with Lionel's position. Not sympathize, but more like understand, like it's not just science. And that's like in the beginning of the pandemic, we were like, oh, trust the science. But it's like, it's still capitalism, capitalism still influences this. And Lionel's character is a perfect example of the reality of science, you know, especially in a for-profit healthcare system that we live in. We don't just get vaccines. It's going to cost you. But
Capitalistic science.
An American tradition.
I think there's also this really, like, this is one of the notes I took, but there's this very interesting, like, dynamic with Miles, or with Lionel, and, you know, Clear, right? Like, because there's this scene, like, right from the beginning, it's like, you know, Miles wants to go ahead with Clear, and Lionel doesn't want to. And, you know, there's that scene with them in the Mona Lisa room, I guess, for lack of a better word, right? Where Lionel is, like, cautioning Miles, but he's not saying no, you know, which I think is an important detail. He's just saying, like, we need to do more testing. Like, we need to properly test this thing. We need to make sure it's safe. Like, we don't know the risks. Like, we're putting people's lives at danger. And Miles, which seems like a reasonable thing to say, you know, like, he's not saying, no, we won't do it. He's just saying, let's do the proper steps for it. And that's not acceptable to Miles, right? Because Miles, like, is chasing this thing, you know, this short-term, like, grandiosity, right? He wants to be in the same breath with the Mona Lisa, and, you know, he's not willing to wait for that. You know, he's not willing to risk maybe the chance that it doesn't pan out. He just wants to go ahead with it, for the sake of, like, having the profit now, you know, which I think is, once again, just a great analogy for, like, the way that corporations, people like Miles, seek out profit under capitalism, right? It can't wait. It can never wait, regardless of the cost, you know?
Yeah, and he's not used to hearing no, and it's always worked out so far for him. So why wouldn't this work out?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the only character left is, so there is Andy, who we only kind of have a taste of from the flashback scenes. But maybe I think that Helen is worth discussing, which is, you know, you don't know, it's obviously at the beginning, you don't know it's Helen until we get the flashback scene and kind of get their backstory, which I think we should also talk about, because I have another question that's interesting to see if anyone noticed. But what do people think about Helen's character? Because she is sort of what I saw as, maybe she was working class teacher, they mentioned in sort of the flashback scene. So she's one of the only people that still remains as that working class person. You know, maybe she was a stand-in for, like, the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, as we see her kind of trying to take things down, trying to expose what they're doing, what this system or Miles Braun or the whole group of them are creating. So those are just, I don't know, those are some ideas.
Yeah, she wants justice. Overall, overarchingly so, wants justice. Yeah.
And she had sort of a limitation, like Marta. Was that her name in the first one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hers is, like, her ability to, like, hold her alcohol, right? So each of these I guess, like, the innocent characters in the story kind of have a handicap that sort of, like, makes them kind of have, like, a quirky limitation that eventually kind of plays out in a way that complements the story, which I kind of like about as a parallel of both of these stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. I thought that was just, like, also just a fun storytelling, like, aspect from both of the movies. Like, I don't know, it's not, well, I mean, I guess you know, Helen not drinking alcohol is a realistic thing, but, like, in the first one, it's more overblown, and right, and then in this one also, like, the way that she just doesn't realize it's Jared Leto's kombucha, like, they're kind of ridiculous in regards both times, and it's just, I don't know, it's just a fun little storytelling element that, like, plays into the mystery aspect of it real well, I thought.
But in both movies, it feels like those little devices end up working to their benefit. I mean, in some sense, I think that's what you're saying, Al, is that in the first one, Marta, you know, is able to hide her tell. And then in the second, in this movie with Helen, she actually, you know, I think that Blanc makes a comment like, you should drink more often. Like, this is actually helping you. The thing that you don't normally do is actually your, you know, to your benefit.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's there's an analogy you can put there, but that aside, I think it's also just a fun story.
No, that's for sure. So I think those are all the characters as far as it goes.
Oh,
we kind of talked, I
wait,
think, a bit
hold
about.
on.
Did we miss
Whiskey.
one?
Yeah,
Oh, whiskey. Yes, you're right.
And I had a note about whiskey actually.
Oh, go ahead.
Because there's this scene where whiskey is talking to Helen, right? They're walking, and she's telling like about how she's basically trying to use Duke to like get more exposure. And she's not like, and she talks about how like she's not really bought into the like his whole deal, right? Like, he doesn't think she doesn't think the men's rights thing is gonna like play well like later on if she gets bigger. But there's this dynamic where like she's not yet like as successful as the rest of them, but she's trying to get there, right? She's playing that same game. And like even though she has some qualms about Duke's, I don't know, politics, I guess, or like about his philosophy on things, right? Like she's willing to go along with that because it like serves her in the short term, and she's trying to get to where the rest of them are, kind of, with a larger audience and a larger like cultural pull, which I don't know. I think is interesting. Like I think Helen is the true stand-in for like a middle class, like working class character, but I think whiskey is like maybe a stand-in for like working class people who are like buying into the game, who are bought into the game, and who are like trying to succeed at capitalism, but like haven't really done that yet. I don't know. I think she was an interesting character.
She was. I thought about this too. Like it's interesting that so when Birdie is talking about her achievements, she's on the other side, yawning, kind of making a scene about how boring these exploits are. She represents a parallel to Birdie. She is now what Birdie once was, and it threatens Birdie's archetype because she's usurping her as the lover archetype. And so Birdie's feeling a sense of obsolescence. She sees her as a threat when she pops out of the pool after Birdie walks up ostentatiously to the chair to show off. Whiskey pops out of the pool and like kills her flow. Like it's a bummer for her, and it's very, very poignant in the storytelling.
Yeah, I was going to mention the pool part too. Is that she definitely is. You could say she's more like the current generation, Gen Z type, perhaps, or even I guess even I don't know. They don't really say how old she is. They don't really give anyone's age officially. I'm assuming everyone is in their mid to late 30s. Late. Well, I guess Claire has kids, so I don't know. She could be in her late 30s. But yeah, that's neither here nor yeah. So you're right. Whiskey, I think, is an interesting character.
She's the new age.
Right.
Well, I just think it's interesting, like seeing the way that she is just kind of starting to compromise her sort of morals, I guess, or her sense of like right and wrong, in a way that like the other main 5 characters have already done. They're already there. They're already in it. But, the way she talks about it, she's like, oh yeah, I know Duke's thing isn't good, but like, it's going to get me somewhere. Right. And she's just I feel like she's on the same journey that they're on, but like she's still getting there. And I don't know. I thought that was an interesting kind of analogy.
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. So I think we kind of talked about the or like you brought it up, Soren, is the meritocracy. So I think one of the scenes I think is worth discussing. So we've kind of gotten to the point. We kind of discussed the box and how they've all gotten to the island. They all have their stand-in masks for all their different kind of personas. They're now there. They've gotten their island. Another joke that I think is really funny is the Banksy doc, which I think is pretty funny. That this idiot can't have like a good doc, the piece of shit. But they're at their rooms and they reconvene at the pool and they kind of have this, kind of show off match between Whiskey and Birdie. And then I think one of the scenes that I think brings up and makes you think of the meritocracy and some other themes of it too is when they're talking about being a disruptor, which is like the big thing about them. Like that's how they refer to themselves, as disruptors. And I think it's interesting how that plays into the idea of meritocracy, the idea of what they really mean by disruption. Because he has an interesting quote where he says,
Yeah.
you want to break the system. You want to,
Mhm.
but nobody wants you to break the system. So that's disruption by doing it. But really, nothing they're doing is even close to any of that. So I don't know. That scene is open for many things.
So what I loved about that, as far as like a foreshadowing, is what Helen eventually does, which is she starts breaking something insignificant at the end. And he's kind of like, okay, have your fun. And then she progressively breaks bigger and bigger things until she gets to the one thing that crosses the line, as he tells in his speech. You break that one thing that's going to push it over the edge, and that's a true disruptor. And so she basically embodies this thing that he thinks he does.
Mhm. Yeah, I really, I hadn't thought of that in the context of the disruptor speech, but I will just say like that final scene, like from the point where Miles burns the napkin, basically to the end of the movie, for me was like, I really like this movie, and I've heard a lot of people say that like it's a little heavy-handed, and I think I would agree with them, except for that final sequence. I feel like that final sequence took this movie from like being enjoyable and a good movie to like being very good, because there's just so many parallels there for me, particularly about the way that like revolutionary action works, I think, right? And the way that like dismantling systems work and the different like power dynamics as that goes along. And yeah, I that's just another parallel there. It's like the way, yeah, that it definitely ties into what Miles was talking about like, disruption, right? Where she gets to a point where then they become uncomfortable. He breaks the thing, or she breaks the thing that he doesn't want her to break, right?
Yeah, that's a good point about the. Well, I think like you said, I think those two things, like what you said, Alan Soren, I think tie into each other. Is you could call the disruption as the system is actually what he's really referring to is capitalism, and the disruptor is the revolution or protest or whatever it is to get noticed. Like he didn't notice them until you. And I also was thinking about it as like the protest during Black Lives Matter, where it was referred to as riots because some people broke some buildings, heaven forbid, so he didn't really care about the rich don't really care about these buildings. It's just stuff that they can insure. But then when you reach beyond that line, like you both said, and you burn the Mona Lisa, you can't undo that. That's the
Yeah, I think that speech like early on where he's talking about disruption, like I think that is a really important speech for like the psychology of this movie, because that's how they all want to be seen, like they're not breaking capitalism as a system, right? Which for me, I think this is clearly a movie. I think on the nose, this is a movie about capitalism, right? Like not in the way that it's maybe about like quite as on the nose as like it's an analogy for Elon Musk, right? But like as a whole, like when we're talking about disruption, breaking the system, it's all capitalism, and that's how they want to see themselves. They want to see themselves as doing something revolutionary because that's cool, right? Like no one wants to see themselves as playing into and benefiting from exploitative power dynamics that have existed for like hundreds of years, right? No one wants to see themselves as the bad guys. They want to see themselves as the disruptors, and so they have this whole narrative tied into that, which is just completely fictitious. It's completely fictitious, and then over the course of the movie, right, like we get to contrast that fictitious narrative which he lays out at the beginning with like, oh, by the end, oh, that's what it actually looks like. And like Miles, or not Miles, Benoit has a line, right, like when the glass onion is blowing up behind them, right, where he's like disruption, right, and pretty once again pretty on the nose, but it's like this is what if there's not explosions, like it's not really it, I guess. Anyway.
Yeah, they want to be like some sort of like revolutionary force, but they don't want to give up anything, and that's not a revolution. Huey P. Newton, would completely disagree with something like that. It's revolutionary suicide, so you have to give up certain things in order for there actually to be an actual revolution. And then when the Glass Onion, and towards the end, they all have realized, oh, we've lost this lifeline. Then they're willing to be like, oh yeah, actually I did see that napkin burn or whatever. Then they're actually willing, but that's only when they have nothing to gain and nothing to lose.
Yeah, their lives are inconvenienced for the first time in a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, there's a quote that I think made me think of in here, just because you mentioned the revolutionary aspect, and it's kind of like a throwaway line, but I took note of it. I think Claire at some point when they go into the big room and they're seeing the Mona Lisa, Claire says something like, it's like having a Che picture in your dorm room, which I thought was kind of funny because I think she's making fun of like getting a fake version of the Mona Lisa because you're a fake, you're like a poser revolutionary. I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
Well,
I think it ties into like the way, for me, the Mona Lisa ties into the meritocracy thing, right? Because like that's how Miles talks about it, when it's introduced. He's like, I saw this when I was a child, and he starts talking about like the merit, like the genius of the brush, the way oh my god, is it Da Vinci or it's Da Vinci, right? Yeah. The way Da Vinci could use the brush strokes to make it look like she's looking different ways, and it's like this mythology around it and then that ties into like how it influenced him. And it's just a painting, right? But it's like there's this story that he has around it, of the merit, right?
and
I thought it tied in there.
Yeah, and it builds into like bolstering his ego and his personality. Like his whole personality is name dropping, and like from the very beginning when they're coming up on the shore, he's playing that awful song.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I was telling
Guitar
Amanda about
Center
this.
song.
I used to work at a guitar shop, still do, on certain weekends. But like when you hear Blackbird played on the guitar, it's like it's almost like that tone that you like trigger like a one of those super soldiers with, like from like just like you hear that and it just like takes you into this different place. Like I can't, like an MK Ultra super soldier. You're just like, no, I can't, and it activates you. It's just like the worst thing you can hear.
Is it better or worse than Stairway?
Right. Well, and that's the thing too. Like I think because of Wayne's World, it portrayed Stairway as like the cliche song to play.
Yeah.
So it's like, Blackbird then. And it doubles down and plays Under the Bridge.
Oh no.
and so it's just like, oh man, like when he starts playing that's when they take you from believing that he's a genius who made this like intricate like invitation to his party to saying, here's who you're actually dealing with,
just a super insecure rich dude.
And no offense to people that are learning guitar and like they stumble on that song, but like
you gotta start somewhere.
You can play other songs.
Yeah.
You can play other songs, but like,
no,
it's just
there are no other songs. That's the only one.
Well, so you mentioned the line. I don't remember if one of you mentioned when he's talking about the Mona Lisa and he says how his mom took him there when he was 6 years old. So I have to ask this question. Immediately came to my mind, especially when I watched it the second time. He's rich before he became a billionaire. Does everyone think he was rich before? Because I asked that because when he's back at maybe we should also talk about the kind of the flashback scene to the Glass Onion too. Mm-hmm. He joins the group. Andy is already kind of like the leader, and they're all kind of down their luck. They're not having success. They're all, working regular old jobs. And all of a sudden they start getting published all because of him. How did he accomplish those tasks, right? How did she then win like a local race with his help? How did he get published? How did he get onto YouTube or Twitch or whatever it is? So my theory was he already was independently wealthy.
Yeah.
And he just needed ideas to steal.
You
like most rich people.
I think that it would be an injustice to the storyline to portray him as a self-made billionaire because it doesn't exist in real life, you know, like,
Yeah.
and so he's clearly, like Paris at age 6.
He had a nest egg, is that what it's called? Something like that. Yeah, he had some capital start.
I think that that's a pretty, like, you know, fair thing to assume. I don't know if that's the most, like, for me, I don't know if that's the most, like, relevant thing to his character, though. Like,
No.
the thing, I think the most relevant thing is that, like, he kind of brings, like, the drive or the intentionality to, like, play the game, right? And to, like, go for, you know, not just, like, whatever they're focusing on before, but to go for, like, success, quote unquote, right? And yeah, there's definitely, you know, probably wealth involved in that, right? Like, in the real world, there's always wealth involved in that, right? But, like, to me, I think more so is like the shift for the other characters is, like, you know, he got them to, like, I don't know, start thinking about it in, like, a competitive kind of way, right? Like, yeah, I don't know. I think it reflected more of a culture shift, or for the characters. It's more of, like, a culture, like, mindset shift. That was, like, the biggest thing I noticed with that introduction scene.
Yeah. And you know, then they have Andy. We didn't really talk about her kind of with the characters, but she is the one who, you know, initially is like, has that drive. She wants to succeed, and she does. And so, you know, they help all their friends, and because presumably Miles had money to help her with her idea, and they get it off the ground, they start this $1 billion, you know, company, and he's able to leverage her out because, you know, a billionaire has the lawyers behind them to do it. And, you know, kills her when she threatens his, you know, his way of life, which is not being a billionaire anymore, not being adored and all that.
Not being a person of renowned reputation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Andy is such an interesting character because, like, you know, she's also a billionaire, right? Like, at the time she loses the company, you know, like, she's succeeded at the game. Like, it says that they have equal shares in the company until he did whatever, I don't know, shady business he did with the contract and forces her out. But, you know, she also in the story has that line where she's like, no, this is too far, you know? And I just think that's an interesting, honestly, I don't exactly know what to make of her as a character because, like, is she a myth, right? Like, or is that a real thing that exists in the world, right? Where it's people who, like, play the game to an extent and, you know, think that it's okay to accumulate this massive amount of wealth and to be, like, obscenely, you know, successful, quote unquote, right, in that way, but then also have this kind of, like, you know, reserved idea of, like, oh, well, no, we can't, like, literally use this fuel that's going to blow up the world. And, like, I think that that's, like, kind of maybe the way her character is portrayed. I don't know if if there's a significant, like, real world analogy to that. Like, I don't know if I believe that anyone who gets to that level still has that, you know, level of, like, concern for like, you know, like, the real world consequences. But I do think she's an interesting character for that reason, right? Yeah.
I think that that's a really interesting point. So I've been trying to tie in the idea of their term as the disruptors to, you know, to Karl Marx and, like, the portrayal of capitalism, which was the initial disruptor to feudalism, which was supposed to evolve into socialism and later communism. And so what she represents, and especially, like, I didn't think of it that way, but she represents when capitalism was supposed to end, when it was supposed to evolve into something better, you know, and Miles killed her. And that's what capitalism has done. It's killed the good,
the dream,
the desire to evolve. It's killed it.
So she wanted to actually grow something, and kind of like the side effect was her becoming wealthy from it, but she actually meant. I wanted to. I didn't get a chance to do it. I wanted to like zoom in on like the napkin that she had originally drawn, kind of have it on there. I tried to pause it, but you couldn't really see it.
Oh,
To
I
see-
paused it and zoomed in, and it's hilarious. It's
Oh,
just
is it?
buzzwords. It's just
yeah,
tech
okay.
buzzwords. It means nothing.
Okay. Well, that forget that.
Yeah, yes, like literally. Yeah.
But I'm thinking, so she does feel like she wants to do good, and it, money is like the side effect that comes along with it, because capitalism rewards the people who are willing to. She still obviously stepped on people, exploited people to do what she did. But yeah, I could see what you're saying, Al, is that she wanted to. Clear was dangerous. She knew that it would destroy their company and the world, perhaps. And she wouldn't let him do it, and he couldn't allow that to happen.
Yeah, I really like that read on it, Al. Like that's, as I just said, I was like not really sure what to make of that sort of analogy, but I think that's a great way to read it. Yeah.
I don't know that Rian Johnson maybe had that in mind, but I think it's perfect.
Yeah.
Well, and that's also just like how capitalism is like the profit motive. Like, year after year, you have to keep on making more and more profit, and you have to like, there's no sedentary. That's when people, and also like I'm looking at a picture of the napkin, and all my sociology classes, like talking about like boom and bust economy, like they all look like this. Like this is almost an exact like replica of all the little graphs that we study. So I'm like, oh yeah, I know how this works. Yeah, lots of buzzwords, but yeah, that's a very good. I didn't even think of it that way.
And then do you mind if I bring up? So I can't divorce Rian Johnson from The Last Jedi. I just can't. It's such a deep wound for me.
Yo,
I noticed.
Last Jedi apologist right here. I thought that was the best of the final trilogy.
Oh.
Hands down. I'm not a hardcore Star Wars fan. I don't know the extended universe, but like as a movie, okay. Anyway,
go ahead, Al.
Well, I think that there's a certain amount of like a dig that he's doing with a couple of the devices in the story. So he's talking about breaking something that shouldn't be broken. Kind of like. I feel like that's kind of him saying like Star Wars was so precious to so many people that he felt like he had to break it, And two, I think that like the fax machine, that's the only technology that he likes because it's analog. And if you talk to a Star Wars purist, there is like practical effects. I need like practical effects, and I need all this kind of stuff, or it's not a Star Wars film. And so it seems like he's taking sort of a tongue-in-cheek sort of dig at.
You want practical effects? Here's the fax machine.
Here's a fax machine, you dinosaur. And so I appreciate that sort of like. I felt jabbed by it, and I felt like I got him a little bit,
Yeah, you personally got him.
I think he's clever enough to weave that in, if ever so subtly. I wouldn't put it past him.
I've been reading this movie wrong the whole time. I thought it was about capitalism. It's about Star Wars.
It's about Star Wars. Always about Star Wars.
This is what I get for not being a real fan. Oh my God.
Well, the fax machine thing is pretty funny, and one thing about we've kind of gotten to the end of the movie, and so, bring up any piece. But one thing that I found kind of annoyingly bad was that after Duke dies, you immediately see like a shot of Edward Norton with like the phone in his pocket. I'm like, the phone's in his pocket. He doesn't have a cell phone. And I felt kind of like, and then I thought like, oh, is that some kind of like trick to like that? I thought that was almost a red herring. Like, oh, at least the first time I watched it. So I don't know. I felt like that was kind of silly.
Yeah. Well, he takes Duke's phone, right?
Yeah, he puts it in his pocket.
And it keeps doing those Google alerts that makes the Mona Lisa shut off.
That's like the best part.
Yeah, I mean it's in plain sight, right? Which I think is like the other like big metaphor analogy in this movie, obviously. And it's just like the name itself, right? Glass onion, like you can all see it. But it looks like it's complex. It looks like it's complicated, which for me, like with the capitalism metaphor, is like I think a really good one, right? Just there's all these justifications, all these complicated systems, right? And at the end of the day, like we all know what's going on. It's exploitation, plain and simple. That's what it's always been. It's not complicated. It looks like it's complicated, but we can see right to the middle, like, he put the phone in his pocket. He's the one who killed him, obviously. Like,
There's a lot of
that's
layers.
true. Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers, and you can see through all of them. So it's just more of we think it's complicated, but
Right. Yeah, that does make it that way to looking at it does make it. It's like, okay, we're not going to even bother hiding this from the audience. Yeah, we're not going to pretend we don't know what's going on. We know the rich billionaire is obviously the evil person at this party, and his, previously seemingly good friends are now beholden to him the whole time. I think we talked about that a bit. The fact that they're all very much, they lied under oath. They're all
in his debt.
Yeah, they're all in his debt. They have to do. They want to keep the cash coming. They have to do what he wants. There's something I was going to mention about that. Can't think of it. Yeah. So as far as the ending goes, whether being a metaphor of the whole thing, do we see that? Miles Braun, does he get? Is revenge served on him? Is it satisfying?
I don't think so. Maybe. I don't know. Yeah, I think you could say it is, but like I also don't think that that's what the movie is about at that point.
Right.
I don't think it's about him as a character anymore, right? I think it's about the glass onion, right? Like the system.
That's true.
Yeah, I think he will recover. However, I don't know. He didn't seem too broken. And also, I just don't trust any of the other characters. Like, it's the ending that you want is like, okay, everybody sees the light or whatever, sees a better path, and they're going to do better. I mean, I don't trust Miles would ever do that. But if we know anything about our judicial system, get back into it, he'll probably just, spend some time in a really nice prison, probably the same one Martha Stewart went to or something. And then he'll just still be maybe he might be like a low grade billionaire, but he's still going to be fine. And that's why it doesn't seem like he's completely defeated. I really want that. But like you said, I don't really think it's really necessarily about him, more as like the system of capitalism, really.
Yeah, I think it's about. Sorry. Good.
No, so that's the disruptor right there.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think like at that point it's about the characters and the way that they relate to Miles and the way that they relate to like the system of Miles's wealth, right? And I could monologue for a second about that end scene that I was talking about. I don't know if this is the time to do that, if we're going to talk about it at a different time, but
no. I mean, usually I'd say like, final thoughts you have. So yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So I think that final scene, right? Like this is the thing that really stood out to me and really for me, like I thought was a little bit more subtle, but really worked for me in this movie more than anything else is the scene, like the way it plays out when Helen decides to like when she confronts Miles, right? And they're standing in that room and she's like, they've seen to the center of the glass onion, so to speak, right? And everyone in the room can see it. Everyone in the room, and I think it's important to keep in mind that like these are all characters, and I view all of the characters. I don't know. I think you can view like their success and maybe be like, oh, they're not working class. They're bourgeoisie. Maybe they're petty bourgeoisie, right? But I think you can also very clearly, read that they're not happy with the system, right? Like they're not happy with their relation with Miles. They're doing it because that's where the money comes from. That is what allows them to do what they want to do. But they all want to kill him, right? None of them are happy with it. And here they are, they're all like standing there and it's just been laid bare. Like, yeah, he literally is a murderer. He murdered his co-founder. And I think the way that scene plays out when starting from when Helen goes around and individually asks all of them and is like, you saw this. Are you gonna like help me out? Are we gonna take him down? Are you gonna like, stand up with me in a court of law, whatever? And one by one, they all tell her no. They all like give her the cold shoulder, and she goes to Benoit at the end. And this is where I think maybe Benoit, you can read it as like an analogy for media, right? Or for like the critical lens that media has on capitalism. Is, Benoit says, right? He says, I've laid it bare, right? But there's nothing I can do. You need to have a little bit of courage. And then he literally hands her a bomb, right? And I love that analogy, right? And then she, she realizes what he's saying, and she goes around, starts destroying things. And at first, everyone's uncomfortable with it, right? But eventually, like, they see like, oh, hey, she's smashing stuff and nothing's happening. She's getting away with it. Hey, this is a party. This is fun. Once again, I think this, like, Evan, like you've been saying, this ties into 2020, right? And the way that like protests or like revolutionary action works is like there's a bandwagoners, right, who join in, like, oh, this is fun, and they all decide, oh, okay, we're also going to topple some things, because once again, they're not happy. They want to let off some steam. And then there's the point where Helen keeps going, right? Like they've smashed all of the little glass statues on the pedestals or whatever. And then, the people who joined in temporarily kind of like are like, oh, okay, well, that was fun. We've made our point. And she keeps going, and they start getting uncomfortable, and they're like, hey, wait, what are you doing? What are you doing? That piano was Liberace's piano. Like, oh my God, you can't do that. And I feel like for me, as someone who went out in 2020 for like years and saw like the decline of people coming out, right, and like started hearing like, there is that dialogue of like, wait, hold on, hasn't this been going on long enough? Like, that's a very real thing. But she keeps going, right? And she keeps going until eventually like Miles himself is like, hey, cut it out. You need to stop. And she doesn't. She blows up the whole building. And then I think importantly, and this is where I think like the metaphor really works, even at that point, like it's still not done. Like the rest of the characters haven't agreed to like go in to like reject the system. She then, even after the building is blown up, she destroys the like idolatry of capitalism, I suppose, in the Mona Lisa, which has been this symbolism from the beginning of meritocracy, of like the justification for the system, and the thing that like Miles worships basically. And she, it's like, okay, that's the final epic scene, opens the thing, it burns up. And then after that, when they're sitting, once she's destroyed that ideal of capitalism, like then all the other characters are finally, for whatever reason, maybe they think it's safe for them, whatever, but like, in material terms, they're willing to say, fuck this guy, can I say that? They screw this guy. Like, I haven't wanted to do this system for a long time, and I'm out now. I'm gonna cut my losses and call it for what it is. I don't know. I thought that the analogies there to like revolutionary action and the way that like those dynamics play out in the real world, I thought was subtle in a way that a lot of the like class based stuff in the rest of the movie wasn't. And for me, like I said, kind of took it to another level for me. Anyway, that was my monologue about the ending sequence of that movie. I really liked it. So yeah.
No, I really appreciate that. I didn't really think of that really like in that scene, that like it does reflect into like our actual with the protests and stuff like that. And we still have, I noticed like in the beginning of like in 2020, a lot of people's reaction to showing support if they weren't in the streets was to buy things. And I was like, why are we using capitalism? But then that stuff's tapered off. You don't see as many people caring about Black History Month, which we're still in. And yeah.
Well, one thing I was that made me think of is when they're all destroying, when Helen is destroying the statues before the others join in. I don't know. I had a vision of it in that moment as sort of like they are the, liberal-ish kind of grouping where, they're like finger waving, during the protest, like, oh, you can't do this. Like you can't protest. You can't, it's too much. You can just paint BLM on like a street. That's as best we can do. And I felt like they finally realized, or they got into it. And like you said, I think when the Mona Lisa goes up in flames, they finally see like, oh, I guess you can do this. It is possible. So that's my add on to that.
Well, and then she noted, because he was so hell-bent on being remembered for something great, I said, you will be remembered as the person who destroyed the Mona Lisa,
Yeah.
And
that was a devastating line.
Yeah, he wanted to be in the same conversation, right? His name mentioned the same conversation as the Mona Lisa. He said that a couple times.
Yeah.
And that's his ego. And he'll do anything to get that petted or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I also think of those people too. Is like, I think about the brunchers. There's the protesters and then the brunchers. People eating brunch, like that iconic photo of like people protesting on the street, and then just down the street there's people just like having brunch. A lot of people don't look like.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you could say, so I guess my question initially was, does Miles Braun get what's coming to him? And I think actually, even though he may still be rich, I think having his ego burn up, in the fire of the Mona Lisa, and he will now forever be seen as this dunce, even if he has money. So in a sense, like, he is broken, even if he's still rich. He is already kind of a shell at this point, but I think that kind of solidifies him as this empty, just, he's nothing.
Yeah, and I think it's also, it's severed like the dynamics. Like, if we're viewing it as the analogy of like all of the other characters and their relation to him as like, all of their individual relations to capitalism, right? Like, those relations have been severed. They've all decided to say, hey, we don't care about the material gain we're getting from this relationship. We're gonna we're gonna stand up to you. And once again, maybe they do, maybe they don't. Does the justice system work out? Very rarely. Like, but that to me is, I think, the end point of the movie. It's not about Miles. It's about everyone else's relation to Miles and the way that they decide eventually, by like, Helen paving the way for them the whole way, like they decide, oh, okay, yeah, we can sever our relationships. And Miles, maybe he has gotten what he deserves or not, but he's become irrelevant to all the rest of them, which I think is like the main point of the movie for me. Yeah, I mean, he's still gonna be wealthy, obviously, but also hopefully he feels real shitty about himself for the rest of his life. So there's that.
Yeah, maybe perhaps a lot of his self-worth is dependent on other people's perception of him. I mean, that's the name dropping and the buying up impressive things. Not that he enjoyed those things, it's to impress other people. The puzzle, the island, everything, So
I thought about Edward Norton as an actor and what he's done in the past and how it kind of ties in to why he was maybe cast as this character. And I thought of The Italian Job. And I don't know if any of you remember what he did in The Italian Job, but he was a thief who stole other people's work, and then he stole all of their ideas of what they wanted to do with their spoils from the heist. So he got the sports car that the one guy wanted. He got the stereo system that the other guy wanted. And so, like, I think that maybe Rian Johnson selected him as an actor to kind of almost encapsulate that sort of character that he played in The Italian Job, not so much as like showing his range as an actor, but to once again play this device that he's probably used to playing in a story. And then just another thought that I had was why they portrayed this story to occur in Greece. So they're showing up on a boat, they're going, and there's a hidden character, and that's Helen, and she's essentially the Trojan horse. That's a hidden sort of like, a loaded sort of
Disruption.
disruptor to the kingdom. You know,
She's someone who doesn't have anything to lose. She's the one person on that island who doesn't have some sort of financial tie, some material stake in her relationship with Miles.
Yeah, that.
And speaking of Edward Norton in other movies, did you guys notice that the painting of himself, it was basically Tyler
Yes.
Durden? I was like,
Yes.
Well, so there's a note in on IMDb, like in the trivia section, where it also connects the color red of all of those, like the wristbands, and Andy's wristband, which was like for root chakra, which is the symbol in Greek mythology as, you know, weddings, funerals, like the symbol of fire and regeneration. So a little foreshadowing.
huh.
I didn't see that before. I just saw that now. I was kind of going through some of these funny things.
I don't know my chakras off the top of my head, so I didn't.
No, I did not. That was interesting. But yeah, so I think you had some maybe shared your final thoughts. But anything else anyone's got?
It was a great movie. If you haven't seen it, not us, you
Yes.
people that are watching us, go watch that movie. Maybe twice.
Yeah,
I enjoyed
think it's
it.
a solid one.
excellent.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Well, Amanda, Al, Soren, thank you all for coming here to discuss the Glass Onion Knives Out story.
Yeah,
Nice to see y'all.
Yeah.
for sure. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you've been listening to Left of the Projector, and you can listen to this podcast on any platform of choice. And have a good one.